Yeah, good evening.
Director sir has also joined the meeting.
Good evening, Professor Singh. This is Sachidanand Sinha.
Sir, can you hear us?
Yes, please.
Thank you,
Yes.
sir. Thank you. So while others still join the meeting, we can get started because we have our dignitaries already here. Respected Honorable Director Sir, Professor T.N. Singh, our eminent speaker for today's lecture, Professor Sachidanand Sinha, my faculty colleagues at IIT Patna and other institutions, students, and all other participants. A very good evening to all of you, and I welcome you all to the lecture series titled Contemporary Development Debates. It is a part of an ICSSR-IMPRESS funded project which is titled as M-Health Technologies for Gender Empowerment in Bihar. We are very impressed with the overwhelming response for this lecture series. To be precise, we have around 220 participants who have registered for this event. So the event is also being streamed live on YouTube. Now, at the onset, I'd like to give you a very brief background for this lecture series. When we were analyzing our field data for this project, and we were trying to comprehend what are the underlying determinants of gender empowerment, it clearly emerged that process of empowerment is linked with development. And as social scientists, we know that development is very context specific and place specific. Hence, it changes over time and space within the broader societal milieu, and there is no cookbook recipe for development. So, in order to develop an understanding of the various perspectives of development, we conceived the idea to organize a lecture series inviting eminent speakers from different disciplines to share their approach to development within the contemporary time. We call it development debates because we acknowledge and would like to accommodate the different standpoints of development that coexist to ensure that we all are able to gain utmost from the lecture of each speaker. The lecture series is spread over 8 weeks on Saturdays in the evening at 7 p.m. Only today being an exception because tomorrow is Gandhi Jayanti and many of us have prior commitments. Against this backdrop, we shall start the lecture series with the inaugural address by Honorable Director of IIT Patna, Professor T.N. Singh. Though he does not require any formal introduction, nevertheless, I'd like to tell you a few facts about Professor T.N. Singh, who is a professor at the Department of Earth Sciences, IIT Bombay. His research and teaching contributions in field of earth sciences is unparalleled. He had been the recipient of various awards and honors, including, but not limited to, the John C. Graham Prize, Best Paper Award, ISR-MTT Indo-Rock, just to name a few. And given his expertise, he serves in the editorial board of innumerable international journals of repute, including Open Journal of Atmospheric and Climate Change, Global Perspective on Geography under American Society for Science and Engineering, USA, just to name a few. He was also the Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi Kashi Vidyapith, Varanasi, and it is our good fortune that he has joined IIT Patna as the director to usher in a new era in IIT Patna. Despite his busy schedule, he has very kindly agreed to be present for today's event. May I request Professor T.N. Singh to kindly deliver the inaugural speech for the event. Sir, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction. The chief guest and the eminent speaker of the today's debate, Professor Sachidanand Sinha, the convener of this program, Professor P. Raj, eminent scientist, and my dear students who have been joined from the different institutions, a very warm greeting from IIT Patna. I am very happy that lecture series on contemporary development debate is being organized by IIT Patna under the leadership of Professor P. Raj, which is funded by ICSSR-IMPRESS funded project. Though I am not purely a social scientist, but nevertheless, nobody is say that they are not a social scientist. Because if you being in a society, then everybody has to think about the welfare of the society and understand the difficulty of the society in totality. So on that point of view, yes, I also be claimed as a social man, not the social scientist. I think it is important that we understand the development in the holistic way. If it is not a balanced development, then it is called as a defective development. Just like in a human body, if a part is partly strong and another one is not strong enough to balance it, then this kind of this body is known as a defective body. And similar situation in the society, if the two components of the society is not equitable, they have not a equal opportunity to work on, then I think our development needs to be debated. And I think this is the topic why the contemporary development debate has been organized. Of course, most of the social scientists are engaged in various kinds of social research in the form of the enriching the community, try to resolve their issue. But most important one in this state like Bihar is the health and the education, on which, though the education, we have a numerous institution, a large number of the university, number of colleges, but the presence of the women section will be not a very encouraging and appreciable. And this is the area where government is also trying to do a lot. And we as a social scientist and as a responsible citizen of the society, we have to also work the way we like and the way the society needs. The lecture series will be definitely provide an inputs about the understanding of this gap and how this gap can be bridged through the various means and methods. I think the scientists, social scientists particularly, they are capable and able to provide us, guide us, so that we can meet this requirement so that the society is having the holistic development. We have a list of eminent speakers on this area, those who will speak on this coming day from the various organizations like Professor. Today we have a very eminent speaker from his area of expertise, is a well-known Professor Sachidanand Sinha. Then we have speakers in Madhumita, the Director of Public Health at this AIIH and PH Kolkata. Rajesh Chandwani, he is from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and who is also the chairperson of the Center of Management of Health Services at IIM. We had also a presence in the future is Professor Arpita Chattopadhyay from the International Institute of Population Science and Dr. Mahati from the Development of Liberal Arts at this IIT Hyderabad. Now we know both the health and education are important yardstick for the development, but it is necessary to explore how different societal problems and social institutions play its part that has a direct or indirect bearing on the society. We therefore think that these parameters must be conceptualized that the larger debate on the development. So today we are starting with a very, very eminent speaker from the Center for the Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is going to set a tone to enlighten us with the pivotal issue of this matter, and also he will keep this debate ongoing, and he will certainly pinpoints various issues related to this development and how this development will be going to resolve the issues which is the longest standing. There are certain outstanding questions from the society, and society always asks to the learned people whether we are able to provide a amicable solution for the problem related to the literacy, about the hygiene, about the health, about the malpractices, and all certain ill effects of the society which prevents the female to come out from their family boundary to work for the society. So I think we have many other speakers which will they will speak on the different occasions, from Tulsi Patel from the Delhi School of Economics, and then many others. So with this, I must congratulate the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities of IIT Patna, who has taken the lead to have a discussion at the national level on a very, very pertinent issue. And these issues are outstanding from a long time. Now it is a right time to discuss, debate, and dissolve all the issues which can be beneficial for the healthy society, and we can say the all-round development of the society. So with these words, once again, I welcome the Honorable Speaker of the today, as well as I wish my best wishes for the rest of the lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your motivating speech. It will enable us to be more focused and also allow us to develop a broad understanding around the areas of health and education for development process. Now, I would like to introduce our eminent speaker for today's lecture, Professor Sachidanand Sinha, or Sachi Sir, as we fondly call him. Professor Sachidanand is a professor of social geography at Center for the Study of Regional Development, CSRD, at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. He works in the area of access to social amenities, particularly education, healthcare, housing, and related development issues among the socially deprived sections of population in India. He was member of the working group for the 11th plan of UGC, University Grants Commission, working group for development of model colleges in educationally backward districts of India, Ministry of Minorities Affairs, and Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. During 2010 and 11, he served as a consultant to the Punjab Governance Reforms Commission, and later in 2012 and 2013 as the chief advisor of the core group for development of school textbooks in social sciences for the government of Rajasthan. And I must add that I am very fortunate to be taught by him at CSRD, and he still is a mentor for me. And I believe that no development perspective can be well received until we analyze the role of specific actors involved in the process, especially the role of state, the role of market, and of course, those of the citizens. So today, Professor Sachidanand's lecture on state, market, and citizens, deconstructing contemporary development discourse, will provide a broad canvas to conceptualize the contemporary development debates. Now, I request Sachi sir to kindly start his lecture. Sir, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Papia, and thank you, Professor Singh, for setting the tone of the development discourse that IIT Patna has begun. I think, in your introductory remarks, you captured almost all the concerns that social scientists have been deliberating upon. You talked about gaps, which in economics and in the language of social sciences, we call it inequality. You talked about equality of opportunity as something, which is very fundamental. You also spoke about the role of the woman and how in Bihar they tend to lag behind their male counterparts. And you talked about a whole lot of concerns, particularly with reference to education and health, which are two very fundamental dimensions, which in fact would help us understand as to what is the direction in which whatever that is meant by development is going. I am extremely delighted to be part of this debate series, and I don't know, I never thought that it would be the first one. That adds tremendous amount of burden on my shoulder. And I really don't know whether I can answer, or I'll have something to contribute on the variety of concerns that friends and colleagues, those who are participating today, are present and would have. Let me, at the outset, set as to, we have about 50 minutes. So I'll be talking about some of the initial concerns, and basically, looking at this three different, not very different, but interrelated players within the development um, discussion. That is the role of the state and the market and the citizens, uh, and basically trying to, in fact, talk about as to how, in the process of this debate over a long period of time, particularly, this debate has been going on ever since we had the first economic depression in 1929, when the bubble of economic growth, was uh, reviewed and it bursted, and then there have been many directions in which the social scientists have been looking at the question of development. Particularly when we talk about state, market, and citizens, and what I really call deconstructing the development discourse, I would rather be a little historical and will bring in those contexts in order to, in fact, look at the nature of democracy, which in fact is the nature of this democratic Indian state, uh, and how this it emerges in the process of what was very significantly central to the Constitution of India in the wake of the real reality on the grounds, that is, um, with such plurality that our populations, not population, but our people have, because I always make a distinction between population and people. People signify citizenship, while population could add so many others into the realm of it. Because if you look at the census, it counts everybody on a certain day. The basic idea is to basically look at as to where we have faulted, where the state could perhaps develop, or a state increasingly tried developing a new kind of an association with the changing demands of the market and the international capital. And in the process, how it increasingly distanced itself from the needs and aspirations of the citizens, and how citizens today, in the contemporary times, not only in India, but in different parts of the world, seem to be getting um, a certain kind of a tag as to, and this tag has been there in the process of the building up of our nation, where we had this discourse between insider, outsider. It happened in a major way in Mumbai way back in the 60s, the sons of the soil, and so on and so forth. But my question is, my hint is not towards that. My hint is basically that within the Constitution of India, what we really proposed in the preamble of the Constitution, beginning with "We, the people of India," and the phrase that is, in fact, is the guiding principle, which in fact was modified in 1976 with the 42nd constitutional amendment, where socialist was added to the phrase sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and to secure all its citizens justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Nowhere in this preamble there is a mention of the state. The state, that means, is subsumed as a kind of an organizational or institutional dimension of the citizen form the core of our constitutional values. And it is these constitutional values which, in fact, the state is expected to protect. It is the state which has this responsibility to, in fact, protect the citizens of India, we, the people of India. So, with this initial presentation of the preamble, I would go on to, in the second half, or maybe during the narrative that I'll be presenting, I will also talk about as to what were the phases of change which took place in the democratic structure of India, increasingly after the adoption of the constitution. Maybe the process did begin much earlier, even prior to the independence. And the kind of dominance structures that continuously evolved, which made some of the commentators to feel that a new configuration of power structure is emerging, which perhaps would hold the key to realizing the goals or the aspirations of those who have been continuously marginalized or deprived. And the numbers of such people within our economy and society, within our polity rather, was always very large. And it was not only associated with a certain kind of an ethnicity, but a variety of other factors which in fact would get into the structure of dominance, or maybe contradict or counter the emerging structures of dominance. And therefore, it is very important for us to, in fact, put in a bit of thoughts onto the question of what has been, or what changes we could perhaps see in the last 75 years with reference to the social political structure of India, which in fact in the contemporary times, and particularly after the 1990, has moved into the direction of what we call globalized world, which really brings in and which has somehow created a kind of a smoke screen. And I would rather underline this. Be it any kind of a development paradigm, almost every development paradigm from the perspectives of the right or the left, or from the perspectives of the centrist, whether you are a socialist economy or a market-based free market economy, every bit of these discourses have created one smoke screen, has created one singular goal. That is that you have free market, or if you don't have a free market, on the contrary, you have a communitarian ownership of goods and services, of resources, and that is what is going to bring about economic growth. And the more economic growth you have, you are materially benefiting one and all. And that is perhaps has been, in very simple terms, which in fact in textbooks or in development discourses have taken different kinds of incarnations. But they all trusted, or they all believed in the fact that the market, which perhaps would bring about a kind of an equilibrium, which in fact has been contested by economists themselves when there were critiques of general economic equilibrium. The Keynesian economics itself was a critique of this, and the role of the state within this neoliberal or neoclassical framework was considered to be a kind of a major impediment. And therefore, in the history of India's development, I think we cannot really appreciate every aspect of it if we do not go into and examine the first 25, 30 years, and then the next 20 years until about 1990, and then the consequent period which we call the post-liberalization phase, and the earlier one which generally people talk about in terms of license Raj, which of course was a real problem in the course of realizing certain goals which in fact we as a society, we as a polity had placed before ourselves. Now let me talk about the historicality of it. When we got independence, the question of free market did not arise. Perhaps there can be always differences of opinion, precisely because we had absolutely no money. Our exchequer was almost empty, and we had huge responsibility to in fact take steps towards ameliorating or maybe correcting the kind of distortions that had entered into our economy and society during the 200 years of colonial rule. But in spite of that, I think the state of India, or let's call it the government of India of that time, and I'm not making a very significant discussion, difference between the government and the state, because the state is run by the government. The government is supposed to safeguard its citizens, take initiatives in order that they can ensure at least one of the non-negotiable of the Indian Constitution, that is the fundamental rights, which in fact is the right to survival and right to survival with dignity. Now, these are some of the important concerns, which we as a state was supposed to, or our state of the Indian state was supposed to bring in motion. And therefore, it needed a certain kind of an institutional structures. At that particular point of time, or perhaps even after that, if you look into this entire discourse, whether it is a modernization theory or neoclassical or whatever be the nature of the debate, right until the present times, which we can call it neoliberal, the role of the state was conceived in a different way. Initially, it was conceived in a manner that the Western experiences within the framework of the modernization or modernization theory provided us with some kind of a understanding that there were preconditions to economic growth, preconditions to social change, and that the modernization or the kind of experiences of the Western world provides us the direction in which the developing or the underdeveloped countries then were likely to follow. But the conditions on the ground were very different. The conditions of the Western world, and particularly those parts of the world which had a long experience of colonial expansionism and the colonized world such as India, were not the same. And therefore, in our zeal to in fact ape the Western world, we took certain kinds of steps which needed institutionalization, modern institutions, both politically as well as in the field of economy. And no institution, and this is not to suggest that the traditional institutions just withered away. The traditional institutions, and if I may be allowed to borrow a phrase from William Raymond, that the traditional institutions became dormant at times, became emergent at another point of time. And therefore, while the traditional institutions on the ground continued to exist, and this is not to say that the spirit of building the Indian nation was any less significant in any part of India, perhaps this dovetailing between the aspirations of the people and the modern institutions, which could reach out and tap the aspirations of the people in rural areas, in agrarian conditions, struggling with a kind of an stratification and other kinds of problems, to help them wriggle out of those processes. It's not that the state and its institutions did not take steps in those directions. We felt that perhaps, one of the essential measures has to be to, in fact, bring down land inequality through certain measures of land reforms. And we have the experiences in different parts of the country where in certain parts of the world, certain parts of India, it succeeded, in other places it failed miserably. And therefore, one needed to perhaps examine the role of the bureaucracy, because bureaucracies led the modern institutions at the local level and at the national level. Within the kind of federal structure that we had, within the structure of caste, class, ethnic dominance, which in fact existed at that particular point of time. And this is not to say that it was an equal world. A massive inequality existed of all shades and kinds. And therefore, to look at as to how the bureaucracy translated the goals of modernization, or the goals through which the process of social change could be brought in, that aspect, the role of the bureaucracy and its relationship with its society and people of this country, that needs to be evaluated. And I'm really sorry to say that, there have been very few works. People have written so much of what should the bureaucracy do. We have papers in management of bureaucracy management and a whole lot of public administration and so on and so forth. But to address some of the questions which were empirically, which indicated that there was, and that's the proposition which I'm trying to put before you, is that did the bureaucracy try to, in fact, reach out equitably to one and all? Because that is what, following Max Weberian framework of bureaucracy, the bureaucracy was supposed to have done. Now, if we look into some of the important developments very quickly, is the fact that, in spite of whatever limitations that our society had, the state of India was in a position to, and the government of that particular point of time was in a position to put in motion certain kinds of infrastructure, particularly in the field of industries, in the mining sector, innovations and certain kinds of ideas with which, the irrigation network could be expanded. There can be questions on big dams and small dams, but, dams were made, which were referred to as the modern temples. Around 1966, 67, we were really seeing the advantages of some of these measures in certain parts of India. Not that, the trickling down took place everywhere, because, there were structural problems. And the structural problems which were there in terms of the land ownership were not addressed to any satisfactory level. The second phase of major changes that the state brings about in its understanding of the dominant domain, eminent domain, were 3 or 4 major changes which I can perhaps refer to at this stage. One, which I think were extremely revolutionary, extremely meaningful at that particular point of time, was to in fact nationalize the mining, particularly the coal mines, which had tremendous impact on the labor, on the conditions in which the mining labor, the miners lived, were under some kind of a contractual work, lived in utter poverty, were continuously being exploited. And with the nationalization of the coal mines, a new era could be seen to have begun. But then, once you nationalize, then there are winners and there are losers. And losers are not always happy. Number 2, and that was yet another important movement, that was the privy purse was suspended, was really undone. Matters were taken to the court. Those who went to the court, they won. The government brought in legislations. And as a consequence, the court could not do much. One could say, why nationalize banks? But if you were to perhaps look at the experiences of nationalization and the kind of a spread that the banking sector experienced in the years that followed under the lead bank schemes, under the fact that, all welfare schemes and all asset building kind of credits would be moved through these banks. The promises were tremendous. You were tapping the resources in the countryside, even though they may not have too much surplus. But nevertheless, if the banking sector, if you have a bank in the corner, approachable within a few kilometers, you could perhaps think in terms of getting some kind of a credit. The cooperative movement that also began alongside had successes somewhere and failures at another places. These 3 developments, the banking nationalization, the privy purse, and they were the game changers. And all of them, they had losers. Who are the losers? If you look into the class structure of India's society at that particular point of time, then you know who were the losers. And no wonder, not that, I'm supporting the kind of a step that then Prime Minister of India had to take, not had to take or took in terms of emergency, which was suspension of all fundamental rights of citizens. It was an onslaught on the citizens once again. But given the fact that, you had these changes, it did alter to a certain extent, and there has to be some kind of a study which could perhaps talk about as to what it really fundamentally did in terms of orienting or disturbing the traditional structure of dominance. The next important point, and while I'm saying this, parallelly, we are growing in terms of number of schools. We have set up public institutions in different parts of India. If you look into what was the situation in the mid-70s, there were areas where, the schools were not available, colleges were not available. As Professor Singh said, today we have plenty of them, but, we don't have the kind of enrollment of the girls, of the women. So there was expansion. And this expansion meant that, through whatever, if you wanted to really have or to meet the objectives of universalization of education, primary education, particularly at that particular point of time, in spite of the fact that we had not yet constitutionally validated or accepted that, there was right to education, but under the directive principles of the state policy, the state was supposed to encourage or take steps, the private and particularly the voluntary organizations and societies, educational societies, and government schools and colleges expanded. So much so that by the time we had the 7th All India Educational Survey, 6th All India Educational Survey, somewhere in late 70s, early 80s, and if you look into the report, it says that nearly 80% of habitations, not 80%, but nearly about 96% of the total habitations, not villages, habitations, had primary school within half a kilometer or up to 1 kilometer. Encouraging access was yet another creation of opportunity which could create conditions, if not break, for a kind of a transformation that our society needed and would continue to need. Because, we have, among so many other factors, we can very easily establish one thing, that in spite of a stratified social structure, in spite of the kind of a class bias of the Indian bureaucracy, in spite of the fact that, there has been very strong dominant structures, and not to say that there were real people, who really felt for the idea of India. One important aspect, which we cannot miss out is that, we have created a condition where today, if you look into, certainly the non-SC/ST communities have a much higher gross enrollment ratio in education, in higher education. And the SC/ST communities are trailing behind. But there, the situation has also transformed significantly between 2006 and 7 and now. And that education has certainly provided opportunities to the traditionally marginalized communities to, in fact, ask for their rights in various employment sectors, for various opportunities. There have been strong movements, there have been weaker movements, but this has been secularly growing. And one cannot say, and one could perhaps, one can accept that this transformation also happened, the momentum of this transformation, largely because of education, not so much in Bihar, but also in Bihar. And when I was doing this work for the UGC, I found that, and that explains the kind of a class structure of Indian society, even in some of those states which are generally considered to be extremely backward, where 4 to 5 districts of Bihar had a much higher gross enrollment ratio in higher education than 4 districts of Kerala, which in fact was seen even at that particular point of time. And I was questioned by the representatives of the MPs from Kerala, and they said that they don't trust my data. I said, it's not my data, it is the Census of India data, and I have not added, I've only run some kind of a work. So this is what it is. So therefore, what am I really trying to lead this discussion to? The change in the educational scenario and the change which took place in the democratic structures of representative politics and electoral politics in the mid-60s, particularly in Bihar and UP, led to a kind of a transformation on the ground where the demands from the backward classes became much more vocal. In Bihar, it may have started a little earlier. In UP, it may have started a little later. In South India, in fact, it was much earlier than perhaps it happened in the 2 states in the Hindi belt. Elsewhere also, new kind of alliances were made. And therefore, there was a new configuration of representation in the assemblies and in the parliament. And the course, and what really happened after that, all of us are aware of it. These were very significant developments. This only shows, in a certain way, that we, as a democracy, as a democratic polity, through this process of democratization and democratic representation, whether or not before 1977, because people would say that most of these elections may have been rigged, but our post-session experiments, although the allegations could continue to be made, but one thing is absolutely clear, that today our assemblies are far more plural, our parliament is far more plural, but ideologically, whether they continue to be so, whether they are really trying to, in fact, reach out and meet the aspirations of their constituencies. And then comes the structural adjustment in 1990. And after that, we were all told the government should not be in the business of this, government should not be in the business of running industries or running businesses. Well, I'm not going to the past. But today, we can tell you with certainty that, the assets that were built during the last 70 years, 75 years, under this free market proposition of the neoliberalism, is majorly going to shift the control of these institutions, which were in fact created. Some of these industries, some of these institutions may have run out of their time. They needed to be modified, they needed to be resurrected. Whether the private sector or privatization would do that or whatever, to some extent it does appear that yes, we had experienced tremendous amount of reduction in the poverty ratios, poverty headcount ratios between 1990 until about 2006, 2007. 2007, there was yet another crisis. And therefore, after that, we all are very much aware, most of us are very much aware. I would not like to go into that. The question that I'm really trying to posit here is that when we say that, the state is not in the business of running business, when a state is supposed to create conditions under Milton Friedman's kind of a Reaganomics, which was popularized during mid-80s, that the state need not even run educational centers and so on and so forth. They should not be running health. One can ask this question, that if there will be a private sector, if the privatized educational structure can be really meet the target of universal elementary education, which still remains a distant dream, particularly although the claims of one or the other reports may be very different. Today, after the pandemic, we know of a few million children who have dropped out of the school, and to bring them back would be an extremely difficult enterprise. The fact that the market, which believed in profit making, that market, which in fact was seen as a kind of a liberator, a market which was allowed to earn profit because it was seen to have done something good in the public interest. The character of the market and the theory governing these, from the classical to the neoliberal, brought in the question of efficiency, and therefore motivated the state to in fact go against the people. Why I'm saying that it motivated the state to go against the people? It brought in reduction in taxation, especially in different parts of the world. There are different ways through which the corporate taxation has been relaxed in India at different phases. And I'm not particularly referring to any particular phase. There have been ways through which, by invoking eminent domain of the state, how land is taken away from the farmers, or how this market, which in fact is working very differently, is depriving people of their assets. I'll just give you two examples. And this example is very different in the United States and India. And it may be very different from what we experience in Delhi and what people in Bihar experience. But and that is where the speciality of these experiences in development discourse is very important. And these two are the most recent experiences. One is that of what we call is the malls, and the other is the e-commerce. Today, government has started looking into the draft of the e-commerce policies, and perhaps the Niti Aayog is not so happy certain kind of provisions therein. But let us look at as to what has happened onto the ground. In America, the mom and dad stores closed down. That means, people who, in fact, while returning home, would buy their commodities for families and go home, returning from their offices, they closed down majorly because now you had, the malls coming in. The malls gave you very attractive kind of propositions for market, for purchase and so on and so forth. Gradually, all those street corner shops or shops in your neighborhood closed down, and all of them, they became assetless workers in these malls. So what is this development that we're really talking about? Are we really talking about a kind of situation which in fact creates opportunities for deprivation? That's the second question that I would like to, maybe I have asked so many questions, but this is yet another outcome of this growing concentration of wealth. And we all know, and there have been so much of work. I mean, even three or 4 days ago, there were certain statistics as to how much of the total GDP is owned by 1% in India, 1% population in India. The growing concentration of wealth, the growing concentration of productive assets is nowhere hidden from us. So what are the choices that we have as citizens? And what is the choice that the government provides as somebody who in fact holds the control over the policies? Does it really consider the interests of the citizens, build assets there with them? We say, okay, Atmanirbhar Bharat, but more that we have said about Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think there have been increasing assetlessness of one kind or the other in different parts of India. Among the tribes, it's one kind of asset deprivation. What are those parameters which we really want to address? What is more efficient? Is the return from investment or the productive or the profit that we get from the land? Or it is the survival of those assets which people have built over the years? The land was not given to us by the act of God. The land was developed into agrarian for agricultural purposes by the efforts of the people. The people created those assets to farm and to make use of those things, those assets on which they have survived for so long. Yes, we also have assetless population, and for them, the land reforms could not bring much of a success. But some of them, yes, because with the Land to the Tiller Act and with certain kind of legislations which are brought in, the Land Ceiling Acts and all that, a certain kind of redistribution did take place. The class structure of India's polity and India's economy therefore started undergoing a change. So therefore, the second aspect of how the market and the alliance between the market and the state has really led to deprivation, increasing deprivation of people in different parts of India, may not have happened in the same way in Bihar. And that is as to how this asset could be protected by the policies of the state, which perhaps is gradually moving out, not only through malls, but also increasingly through e-commerce. And recently, I saw something, a kind of a silver lining, where some of these e-commerce platforms were trying to rope in the local vendors in their supply chain. Now, what will be the consequence of that? It's yet to be studied because this is very recent. The third aspect is what I call industrial federalism. And what I mean by industrial federalism is something that, the big industries produce something and the smaller ones, the MSMEs, produce something else. We know as to what really happened after demonetization. Large number of MSMEs were closed down, rendering thousands and millions of people jobless. So what is that we are really talking about? The growing internationalization of capital, the growing internationalization of labor, the government not coming to the rescue of the labor through labor acts, where most of them have been relaxed, where there is such a drastic change in the educational policy that we are really talking about. And some of us may be feeling good about it, but if there are questions, I'll certainly talk about that. All these things and some of these developments are pointing towards one thing for certain. And this is not my hunch. I'm looking at as to how this is getting built in. And that is that we are going to create a kind of a situation where that classical surplus of labor is available at a price which could only be very close to their subsistence wage, and that would bring in yet another phase of what I call the modern slavery. It's certainly going to help some people in the income hierarchy or in the social hierarchy. But even those whom we call the upper middle class are not going to remain unaffected by the kind of changes which are taking place and the direction in which these changes are likely to happen. So what is the way out? The way out is to, in fact, and I just mentioned decentralization, decentralized federalism. The only way out is perhaps, to think in terms of creating assets. And these assets more in the hands of the people would have the basis to, in fact, underline their survival and grow. Number two, we have to, in fact, further bring about reforms in education. Access cannot be discounted at behest of what is known as quality. The quantity-quality debate is superfluous. If you do not have, India is not a monolith. The density is varied tremendously. And you cannot close down your schools just because they appear to be uneconomic to your proposition. There is right to education since 2009. And there is a tremendous dilution in the content of right to education, and you can see that in the new educational policy. So therefore, the direction in which our economy and our development is likely to proceed is going to be development for few, is going to lead to a further concentration of wealth, is going to lead to further concentration of productive capital and assets. And what David Harvey, a geographer, mentioned, that there has been a long process of what we call accumulation by dispossession. And I'm afraid we are moving in that direction. What is the way out? Is it the way out in politics? I don't question that, because that is the most important asset. That is the most important process, not asset, which could perhaps bring about a change in the directions of our economy and society. But when the political parties of all shades, be it on the left or on the right, essentially in the perception of people, they do not seem to be very different from one another, there is very little hope. But the hope stays in the spirit of people, because people know how to survive. And therefore, the policies of growing concentration of assets, water, land, and what have you, in the light of the fact that we have tremendous evidences to suggest that the neoliberal consumption-oriented development cannot be sustainable. We talk about sustainable development and all that. It seems yet another smoke screen. Effectively, with more that we are talking about, there are increasing deprivations, not only in India, not only in South Asia, also elsewhere. And I, at the end, talked about citizens, and that pertains to protecting the rights of the citizens as a natural right to survival. And the citizen has to be supported by protecting their wealth. That is not a contradiction to the classical economics, neither to the neoclassical. But it is certainly in contradiction to the neoliberal aspirations through the mechanism that the neoliberalism brings about is yet another smoke screen or bogey of efficiency and merit. So these are some of the important considerations which I thought I'll present it before you. I have taken more than what the time that was allotted to me. I think I have spoken for nearly 55 minutes. So I'll stop here, and I'll be certainly willing to respond to any observation, questions. If you have put in some of the questions in the chat box, I have not been in a position to read them while I was making the presentation, but I'm open to any observation, questions, and suggestions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really admire the privilege that I've had this evening from IIT Patna. Patna is the capital of my hometown, but I have become increasingly alien to Patna. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you so much for your enlightening speech. It is always a delight to hear you. And I remember when we were planning this lecture series, I was a bit hesitant because I knew you are very busy with your research and academic commitments. And when I called you, it was always like Sachi sir, and you just said, give me the dates. And so today we had the opportunity to listen to you. And I'd really encourage if anyone has any comments, questions, you can unmute yourself and ask sir, or else you can also write in the chat box.
Hi, Shaban, I see you. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Dhiraj. Thank you, Aditya.
Sir, thank you so much. You have really raised very serious issues, very sensitive issues have been discussed. And really, these are very hard to be answered, and the policies are such. And in near future, that serious issue of concentration of resources and deprivation of citizens from the assets, that is really a matter of concern for all of us. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Really enlightening.
May I ask something?
Yeah, Professor Jaglan.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for being.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I just wanted to, have certain queries. One of them was that you were talking about the dispossession of the, citizens whereas we are talking about self-reliant India. Uh, I just wanted to know that do we as a society lack at some level, or as a group, or as a group of citizens, to discuss this particular issue, because this has become imminent, particularly you rightly pointed out uh, after the kind of economic steps which have been taken in the recent past, particularly with regards to demonetization and all, and that impact in fact is seen everywhere. And in the similar situations, when the farmers were put, they have come forward and to protest against it, because this is against, they believe that there is an attempt of corporatization of agriculture, and in a way uh, to make them assetless, because that is the fear they have, particularly in a situation when they don't have alternative employment opportunities. So do you think that as a society in India, we have failed on this particular count, to tell the state that what you are doing, in fact, you are making us assetless rather than you making us self-reliant. And the second comment I would like to uh, from you is that the new education policy, what kind of connect or disconnect that you see in terms of the path of economic development that we are going to take in the future? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Papia, can I take in more questions and then answer them one
Sure,
after?
sure, sir. Sure.
Sir, can I have a question, sir?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is, yeah,
Yeah,
Aditya, sir.
Aditya.
Sir, it's really very spellbound for all the time to listen to you, sir. I want to seek your suggestions on what we have as development paradox with two examples from Bihar. Sir, you were talking about bureaucracy, and one of the reasons that Nitish Kumar government is supposed to be more development friendly compared to his earlier regime is the way he has involved the bureaucracy. And so I'm a little confused there how the bureaucracy for one is useful for ushering in development in an underdeveloped province like Bihar. And another paradoxical issue that I was thinking through when you were talking is about land rights. I understand, sir, and I very much draw from it your talk about people first perspective in developmental discourse, which is important. And I was thinking about land rights of the people. Here we keep on hearing about, I'm in Samastipur today. I drove from Patna for my JE duty for the weekend. And on the way, we were talking about how this province needs infrastructure building and how people should give their land. The reason development is not happening is because people are not giving the land for developmental need. And I'm just, maybe you can throw something for clarity for the confusions that people like us have. Thank you, sir.
Sir, if you allow, may I ask a question?
Sure, please.
Okay, sir. The the uh, the very idea of neoliberal state. I mean, as far as India is concerned, be it central government, be it various states government. I mean, just the recent India incident which happened in Assam. So, have we moved away from the idea of neoliberal state to more authoritarian kind of an regime? This is my question. Should we should we limit ourselves only to talk about neoliberalism or neoliberal state? Rather it's the time when we talk about authoritarian neoliberalism. I don't know what would be the exact phrase to, I mean, to term that. That is my understanding, sir. If you can clarify that. Thank you.
Sir, I think you're
Up,
muted,
Hanji.
sir.
I switched it off because I think
Yes, sir.
Aditya was
There was
somewhere,
echoing.
where it was echoing, so I switched it off.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Right.
yeah. So if you can hear me, yeah. I'll begin with Professor Jaglan's question, and he says he talks about self-reliance, and that would also connect me to Dhiraj's question, uh, and I will come to bureaucracy and land rights and land for development a little later. Uh, what I really find is uh, the the paradox comes about when you say that you want to, and it has been a continuous, unending kind of a uh, uh, proposition, which in fact be any paradigm of development within the fold of free market or within the fold of uh, liberal society. Not that there were no benefits to that, but the I would like to place one or two important observations where the emergence of uh, the new the classical and the post-classical economic development paradigm, which in during the Keynesian phase looked at that was 60s, 70s up to 80s, looked at the role of the state in a very significant manner, uh, and that was the 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 the, the where development processes as they were conceived had emerged from the political understanding of and the social understanding of humanism, where the role of the state was certainly very, very important. And I'm not shying away from saying that the democratic states, and particularly the welfare state of whatever nature that we may talk about, did help people to in fact enjoy a certain degree of liberty. The content of social justice and all these things did come in. A certain dignity of work did happen. And I think these were epochal changes. But what has really happened is, again, in the classical mold of what we can say the colonial or the pre-colonial the way the pre-colonial and the colonial capitalism worked, basically it worked on two important principles. That was the land, the assets, whichever be the productive assets, and the labor. The industry or the industrial capital and the finance capital made the best use of it, as long as these did not hinder or become a hurdle to their profit-making enterprises. And gradually, when the base of that started expanding, the threat was seen. And that is why, you invented a kind of an economics, you invented a kind of a free market, you invented the question of efficiency in resource use and all that. And you again wanted the state to use its power as the dominant, eminent domain to appropriate the conditions. And Aditya, I'll come to land for development question a little later. So what I'm really talking about is that self-reliance that we are really talking about is, to my mind, is a slogan. On the ground, there is nothing that is really happening. Even if we look into the Skill India, even if we look into the question that, are you really trying to help build assets? What is going to make people self-reliant? I think it's going to be access to assets, productive assets. rather than making them an employee or a casual wage earner. And that is where the question stays. When I look at the Kisan movement, the farmers movement, I am more worried about the third proposition, because that reminds me of the pre-Champaran days of the colonial rule in India. The times of what is known or what is recorded in history as Neel Darpan, a famous play by one Mr. Matra, and the kind of a proceeding that took place following that publication of that play in the court of Calcutta. In fact, if I were to perhaps compare the two experiences as to what really happened after the farmers went to the court, it's very similar. That is linked with the question of contract farming, and you know it better, Professor Jaglan, as to how contract farming will become instrumental and how it was made instrumental with no protection that the contracting parties would have, basically the farmers would have from the state. The corporate contractor can walk out anytime, but the farmer cannot walk out. There's no protection. So therefore, I think the development paradigm has to come from these sectors of engagements, the farming sector, the sectors of workers, the laborers. And then only something would come up which could perhaps meet the aspirations. There is no way that I see where the onslaught of neoliberalism or the neoliberal capitalist-based kind of a development which we are really talking about, the corporate capitalism, is going to be restricted unless and until you have movements like the farmers' movement. The government may not be talking to the farmers. And I'm not saying that the government is wrong or the farmers are right. But all that I'm really saying is why there is no discussion. After all, they are the citizens. There can be discussion with all parties, but for the students, but for the workers, and but for the farmers. So therefore, that is the biggest problem that we are really seeing in the contemporary regime, which in fact is a political regime clearly represented by the corporate capital. I was yes, and Dhiraj's question that neoliberal state, should we really just critique neoliberal state and not talk about an authoritarian state? I gave you the background that how the neoliberal state entered into some kind of a contract, unwritten contract with the governments, not only in India but internationally. Look at what has happening, what really happened, what has happened in Brazil, what is happening in Mexico, what is happening even in China. There are different kinds of authoritarian reflections that we have in the nature of governance. So therefore, when you cannot have accumulation through the means that you feel is more democratic within the structure of democracy, then you invoke, and there will be absolutely no two reason that an authoritarian regime. And what else do we have at the moment? We have the authoritarian regimes of one kind or the other. And what really defines an authoritarian regime? I'm not saying that there is a huge concentration of power in one place. That, of course, is there because the entire fabric of federal and decentralized decision-making process has undergone a change. And we need to, in fact, look into that. And therefore, and secondly that there is no debate, there is no communication, कोई वार्तालाप नहीं हो रहा है सिटीजन्स, इस देश के नागरिक और सरकार के बीच, और एक बहुत ही बड़ा तंत्र काम कर रहा है लोकल लेवल पे, स्टेट लेवल पे, जो एक दूसरे तरह की इकोनॉमिक्स और सोसाइटी गढ़ने की प्रक्रिया में लगा हुआ है, और उसके बारे में शायद हम में से बहुत सारे लोगों को पता नहीं है। कोई और मौका होगा तो उससे बातचीत करेंगे, लेकिन जवाब इतना लंबा नहीं हो सकता। बट मैं कह रहा हूं कि अथॉरिटेरियन स्टेट, अभी हमारे पास जो स्टेट है वो अथॉरिटेरियन स्टेट ही है, क्योंकि वो बात नहीं करता, वो डिसेंट्रलाइज्ड डिसीजन मेकिंग में विश्वास नहीं करता। ब्यूरोक्रेसी की बात की है, और मेरे ख्याल से आदित्य आपको पता है, आप इसको समझ सकते हैं कि मैं सिर्फ एक एग्जांपल लूंगा एजुकेशन का, और फिर आएंगे हम दूसरे मुद्दों पे। ऐसा क्यों है कि स्टेट के पास एजुकेशन का एक बहुत बड़ा वजन है, सारी जिम्मेदारी स्टेट्स के पास है। बिहार में भी स्टेट गवर्नमेंट ही सारे खर्चे उठाती है, सरकार सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट से बहुत कम सहयोग मिलता है, और जो भी सहयोग मिलता है वो माइक्रो मैनेज भी होता है, यानी कि स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स के खर्चे और उसके जो डिसीजन के जो प्रोसेस हैं उसको सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट माइक्रो मैनेज करता है। आपने देखा होगा वो जब हम रोगी कल्याण समितियां हमने बनाई, या हमने वो राइट टू एजुकेशन के पहले जो सर्व शिक्षा अभियान की जो प्रक्रिया थी जो एलिमेंट्री स्कूल्स के लिए किया, ऐसा क्यों है कि हम इफेक्टिवली एक ऐसे जगह पे जाके रुक गए हैं बिहार में भी, जहां मेरे ख्याल से मैं जो समझता हूं कि पिछले 15 से 20 साल से इलिटरेसी की बात छोड़िए, लेकिन वो तबका जो कि स्कूल में आता है, जाता है और बाहर रहता है, और वो तबका जो कि कभी स्कूल नहीं गया, उसकी संख्या लगभग स्थिर है। और यहीं पे मेरे ख्याल से उस डोमिनेंट सोशल स्ट्रक्चर की मैं बात कर रहा हूं, जिसका हिस्सा बिहार की ब्यूरोक्रेसी भी रही है बहुत पहले से। रिफॉर्म्स को जिस तरह से पहुंचाना चाहिए था, जहां पे उसको मेडिएट करना चाहिए था, वहां पे शायद वो लैंड का क्वेश्चन हो, चाहे वो एजुकेशन का क्वेश्चन हो, वो उस हद तक नहीं कर पाया। ब्यूरोक्रेसी के पास ट्रिमेंडस एबिलिटी होती है पॉलिसीज को भी को भी इन्फ्लुएंस करने की। लैंड राइट्स पे कहना जितना भी होगा कम होगा, लेकिन थोड़ा सा आपने जो बात कही है कि लैंड फॉर डेवलपमेंट नीड्स, मेरे ख्याल से अब हम इस समय वो बात कर रहे हैं जबकि पर हाउस होल्ड जो होल्डिंग साइज है वो इतना छोटा हो चला है, और उसके एवज में जो रिहैबिलिटेशन की जो प्रोसेस है, उसके जो तजुर्बे हैं, उस पे लोगों को विश्वास बहुत कम है। ये ऐसा नहीं है कि बिहार के लोग विकास नहीं चाहते हैं, विकास सुन सुन के वो थक चुके थे। जब नीतीश जी की सरकार ने रोड्स और बिजली का सुचारू प्रबंधन किया तो मेरे ख्याल से लोगों के अंदर काफी खुशी हुई। ऐसे ही नहीं वो आए वापस, 3 सत्र उनका 3 सीजन्स ऑफ। लेकिन मुद्दा ये है कि ये जो पूरी की पूरी जो समझ है उसको हमको लोगों तक पहुंचाना पड़ेगा कि हाँ आपकी ये जरूरत है और इससे आप बेनिफिट होंगे। अगर हम देखें जो तजुर्बे रहे हैं, चाहे वो दिल्ली के आसपास रहे हों या दिल्ली से दूर रहे हों, आप उनको देखिए। जो वो क्या कहते हैं न्यू ओखला जो नया टाउनशिप बना है एक ओखला के और पूरब में, उसके इनिशियल डेज में मैं भी इन्वॉल्व था उसके साथ। और वो आपको मालूम है कि वो कितने दिनों तक वो उनके जो हर्जाना उनको मिला था उसका केस कितने समय तक चलता रहा। आपने कहा कि हम ये इंडस्ट्रीज के लिए आपसे ले रहे हैं फार्मर्स से, और आपने दे दिया प्राइवेट बिल्डर्स को। आज की तारीख में मेरे ख्याल से 12 मिलियन यूनिट्स, हाउसिंग यूनिट्स हिंदुस्तान में खड़े हैं, जिसमें पिछले 7-8 साल से कोई नहीं रह रहा। गवर्नमेंट के सामने इतनी बड़ी समस्या है रिहाइश की, वो अपने एमिनेंट डोमेन का इस्तेमाल क्यों नहीं करती? सवाल ये है। डेवलपमेंट के लिए जमीन चाहिए, मिलेगा उसको, लेकिन उसको वार्तालाप करना पड़ेगा। और मेरे ख्याल से ये 2 दिन में खत्म नहीं होगा। उसके लिए आपको सुचारू रूप से लोगों के साथ इंगेज करना पड़ेगा, उनके डिप्रीवेशन के क्वेश्चंस को भी आपको एड्रेस करना पड़ेगा। अगर रिहैबिलिटेशन का कोई मॉडल जो सक्सेसफुल मॉडल हमारे बिहार में हो, तो लोग जरूर से लाभान्वित होना चाहेंगे। रिहैबिलिटेशन का कोई एक मॉडल हमको बता दीजिए, चाहे वो तिलैया डैम हो या डीवीसी हो या वो कोई भी एक्सपीरियंस जो एक पुराने क्या कहते हैं पुराने बिहार के परिप्रेक्ष्य में हमारे सामने, जिसके बारे में हम जानते हैं। तो मेरे ख्याल से मेरा उत्तर इतना ही होगा। I think there are a few more observations and questions which are there.
Sir, I am audible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you're not very tired or like.
No, I'm not
There can be a
tired.
quick
I'm not
round-
at all tired. You
There
know,
can be a quick round of questions from our students. I think they are very
yeah,
enthusiastic.
I think that's
and
more important. Yeah.
Sir, in your address, you were mentioning about banks, and I too see that banks.
Could you be a little louder? I'm hard of hearing.
Yes, sir.
Look at
Sir,
my age.
it is better now, sir.
Yeah, it's much better.
So, in your address, you were mentioning about banks, and I too see that the banks are coinciding to the state, market, and citizens. So, if we look at the development from the purview of roti kapda makan only, that is from the availability of the basic amenities to the masses, the present economic system where banks, sometimes independent of the government itself, create an interest-based economy where the game of musical chair is played every time, and everyone will here lose his seat once the song will stop, maybe sooner or later. So, sir, we would like to know your comments over this system which is going on in terms of the currency reserve and the banks and the economy which we are having today in our
And what I was talking about nationalization of banks at the time in a historical background. I really am not a student of financial systems, and therefore, all that I know that even with the nationalization of banks and the outreach of the banks becoming much more better, through which people could have access to credits and so on and so forth. We also know that there was a lot of red tapeism, in spite of the fact that you don't really need any kind of a collateral, and yet the banks really do not give you loan, which has really, and every time there is something which we call is a non-productive assets that the banks are building up, and the fear of that is always presented before us, before the citizens, to not to question the fact that banks on those accounts may have failed to in fact come up to the expectations of the citizens of this country. uh, I'll give you one example, which not one, but there are plenty of such examples, there is so much of papers which have been written on rural credit markets and things of that sort. And I'm not a student of economics, so I really can't really answer so many questions. But what I really see is how I'm a student of sociology and geography. So what I really see is how the social, the social standing of a person could perhaps play a very, very important role in accessing credit. And even if he or she accesses the credit, the market and the social capital in the larger social context may not support such a venture. So therefore, it's not just accessing, it's also the process which in fact goes beyond that, which plays a very, very important role. And I know of a number of such experiences in rural areas where, there was segregation, segmentation, where people said, this person doesn't come from that caste, and why is he really opening up a business of this kind? So therefore, this question was not so very important when I was a child, although I grew up in a very, very caste dominated kind of a background. Increasingly, it was, it was, it had started simmering in mid 70s. But by the time you are in the 21st century, you see and that we have gone back to these identities, and somehow these identities are being placed as a kind of a divide for the corporate plunder that will go around, that will go behind the scene. So while we remain absolutely busy talking about our religion and our caste and our locality and our language, the plunder would quietly happen before we get to know, and then it will be too late. So I think, that's what I can reflect. And I fully agree with you that, the, 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 the private extension of capital in the form of these banks, both in the public and the private sectors, uh, they are yet to play the role that they should perhaps in the context of liberating people, making them self-reliant, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
the
sir.
comment, sir.
I think we can go on listening to sir, and there is no end to it. But may I request Dr. Aditya to please take over and talk about the series a little
Hello,
more?
sir. If you allow, then may I ask a questions very briefly, sir?
Yeah, Birender.
Okay. First of all, good evening, sir, and thank you for your thought-provoking lecture today. I'm students of IIT Patna. So my questions is, it's very simple. I mean, since you have talked about citizenship as a matter of politics and of course the concerns of the state, if I look into the diaspora communities, they are always in a positions of, of vulnerability regarding their citizens in actually in their place of settlement or the country of settlement. So what is your opinions on it? I mean, as a citizen, diasporic community, and also what kind of developmental perspective the government should need to discover to uplift those ethnic minority communities like diaspora community? Thank you so much, sir.
I think, you see, I really do not, I haven't given much thought to it about the diaspora community. I think, they are placed in whichever state, whichever country that they have chosen to be there. And if if I may be allowed to say so, particularly in the West, in the context of Europe and in America also, in most of the developed parts of the world where much of the traffic tends to be um, moving, insofar as the movement from India is concerned, including Australia, there may have been certain kinds of uh, ethnic conflict here and there. But I believe, that by and large, I think the Indian diaspora in the Western world, in Europe and in America, they may still face a certain amount of discrimination, but nevertheless, they are there because their democratic rights are being safeguarded to the extent that those states could do that. So I think they may be minorities, but I can tell you I know of the diaspora community to some extent in California, and I think they have a huge role, and they are very much part of the politics of California, and and whichever part of the world that they're in. I mean, even in UK. So I think to consider them or to see them as deprived, and the Indian government and we should be doing something for them, is perhaps is I think is cannot be one of the objectives of the Indian state, because it can really look at the diaspora, it can think about the diaspora, it can connect with the diaspora. And I think on the citizenship question, there have been changes. Even for voting, there is a proposition that they could also vote. And all these things are positive developments. So while the state and the governments must look at the people who are living in this country, rather, and of course protect the interest of their Indians elsewhere, but you have to make a difference. One is that if they happen to be citizens of America, citizens of UK, I think they have the legal structures in those countries, and therefore it cannot be handled by the government of India, where the government of India could be seen to be interfering in the affairs of those countries. So otherwise, connecting with people who are Indians elsewhere, I mean, is a very good idea. I mean, that's all that I can say.
Thank you, sir. Now we
Thank you.
cannot take many more questions because of the time constraint. So if you have questions, you can email it to us at the email address we had provided in the poster. Now I would request Dr. Aditya to please step in. Can you hear?
Okay.
Please go ahead, Dr. Aditya.
Yeah, thank you. We are really privileged. We will have a formal vote of thanks from our Nalinji, our HOD. But I want to take this opportunity to tell all the audience who are here that we will have this every weekend, like we have next on 9th. Director sir has already talked about it. And I want to tell all my friends here to kindly join for it. We have Professor Tulsi Patel next Saturday. And after Tulsi Patel, she's an amazing sociologist at D School. And then, she worked on gender. She was involved with Indian Sociological Society. The name is Professor Deepak Kumar. He's an amazing person, amazing scholar, as you know. He'll be talking to us about it. Will be good to set the tone. And then we have, Professor Sunil Ray, who was a former director of ICSSR, talking about alternative perspectives. Then we have Professor Aswini Kumar from TISS. After that, in November, we have Iridaya Rajan Sebastian, who will be, joining in the first week of November. In between, we will try to bring in Jeffrey Whitso. Jeffrey has done a very good work on Bihar. His book, Democracy Against Development, is something very, very important. He'll talk about, critically analyzed lower caste politics, role of democracy. We are also in touch with Professor Anand Yang. He is kind of, the time, and he's teaching a course this semester. Professor Anand Yang has done amazing work, his book on Bazaar India. So I'm just trying to advertise the lecture series. This lecture series was, discussed in our department. Dr. Papia proposed. Then we ran this idea through my colleague Rajendra ji, and of course Nalin ji, my senior, and my sister Smriti ji. who perhaps was supposed to join. So all of us mold this idea, and we'll try to have as many lectures as possible. So thank you, sir. And I ask everybody to look forward to more postings from us and join. And before, the time is running out, so may I kindly invite Dr. Nalin Bharti to just formally propose a vote of thanks. Nalinji.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Aditya. Hope I am audible now. So, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Sachidanand Sinha ji for joining this important lecture, very timely lecture. I was remembered when I was working in JNU with Professor I.N. Mukherjee, who passed away a few days before due to COVID-19. And I was working on the privatization in Bangladesh, and I was also looking at that time privatization in India. And the state and market question is still very important in economy, because this is one of the second most populated, one of the highest populated region in terms of poverty, in terms of regional inequality. So such an important talk where you have also on the labor market and other topics, bank nationalization and all other regional aspects. This is again connecting me to my PhD work, and when government of India is proposing a huge privatization exercise, this talk becomes really important. I would also like to thank our director, Professor Triloknath Singh ji, for joining this event. He was also with us yesterday, and in last 2 days, he had joined 2 different programs throughout the session, and I must thank him again for joining this event also. I would like to thank the organizer of this event, Dr. Papia Raj, and not only Dr. Papia, but the entire team of our PhD student, and also the participants inside from the campus, outside the campus, and those participants who has really enjoyed the lecture and asked various questions to Professor Sinha ji. So with this word, I would also like to request Dr. Smriti if she wants to add any point. Dr. Smriti.
Thank you, Dr. Nalin. Good evening, everybody. It's been actually a pleasure listening to Professor Sinha, and it's been a pretty learning experience. I'm from Bihar, and the issues that you've outlined are so very pertinent even in these times. Thank you, Dr. Papia, for organizing this wonderful talk, and Dr. Aditya for coordinating it. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been good listening, sir.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I would also like to express our sincere thanks to ICSSR-IMPRESS for their generous funding, which allowed us to organize this event. And of course, our staff in the R&D department of IIT Patna, along with other colleagues and students that we have talked about. Our technical team led by Sajal, who had made this smooth functioning of streaming at YouTube such as possible. And of course, we'd like to thank all our participants. It is your overwhelming response that motivates us to engage in this type of activities and organize it. And last but not the least, I'd like to express a sincere gratitude to our honorable director, sir, Professor T.N. Singh, for having patiently being here despite his busy schedule and listening and encouraging us to participate in this development debates. Thank you. Till we meet you next on 6th of October for our next lecture. Till then, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Papia. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good
Smriti, I
night.
am also from Bihar.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Can we close it, Papia? Can I?
Sure, sure,
Thank
sure.
you.
We will